Honored guests, it's now my honor to introduce Mr. Joseph Connor, son of Frank Connor, who was murdered by the Armed Forces of National Liberation in the 1975 bombing of Fraunces Tavern in New York. Mr. Connor is an anti-terror advocate with WeWinAmerica.com and Shattered Lives. He will provide framing remarks for our next panel.
Hi, I'm Joe Connor. Thank you for having me here today. Our family has endured firsthand the effects of left-wing terrorism and Islamic terrorism for over 50 years. As was mentioned, my father was murdered on January 24th, 1975 at Fraunces Tavern, the place where the Sons of Liberty met, where George Washington bade farewell to his officers after the Revolutionary War. It was attacked by the FALN. They were a Puerto Rican Marxist organization fueled and financed by Cuba. 24 years ago today, my dad's godson, Steve Schlag, was murdered in the buildings tomorrow, in the buildings right here, as I watched in horror from my 60 Wall Street 36th floor office. I had just commuted through the Trade Center a few minutes before. From New York to DC to Terre Haute to Gitmo, and hopefully to Havana and Saudi, our family's quest for justice against these political terrorists continues. The FALN blew up 130 bombs in the US between 1974 and 1983. Besides Fraunces, the most deadly bombing was at the Mobil Oil Building in Midtown, where I ended up working a few decades later. That was on August 4th, 1977, the same day that they threatened the World Trade Center and caused the first evacuation of 60,000 people from the Trade Center. That was an FALN event. They were connected very closely to the Weather Underground, the May 19th Communist Organization, the Black Liberation Army. I have a lot of documentation, but not enough time to go through that right now. The FALN was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced in Chicago in the early 80s. They were sentenced to 40, 50, 60 years in prison. For seditious conspiracy, for weapons possession, for the armed takeover of the Carter, Mondale, and Bush presidential campaign offices in Chicago. They were never specifically charged with the Fraunces bombing, but they were put away for essentially life. The economics of law enforcement wouldn't allow them to come back to New York to face a trial because the sentences would have been similar to what they were getting in Chicago. That is, they were away for life until August 1999, when Hillary Clinton was running for senator from New York. Bill Clinton offered executive clemency to these 16 terrorists, and for 30 days they were given the ability to communicate between prisons by Eric Holder, who was tasked with the commutations to the terrorists. Finally, on this day, 26 years ago, the FALN walked out of prison, except for Oscar Lopez Rivera. Lopez refused the clemency in 1999, staying in prison. Bombmaker William Morales wasn't offered the clemency. He blew himself up on July 12, 1978, at his Queens bomb factory. It would have been my dad's 37th birthday. He lost 9 of his fingers, 1 of his eyes. He somehow escaped from prison, from Bellevue Prison, and with the help of the family, which is another left-wing organization, escaped to Mexico and has been received safe harbor in Cuba ever since. 24 years ago today, I started writing about it on the train on the way home from the office, and I purposely avoided seeing my cousin Steve. He was a bond trader at Cantor Fitzgerald, and he always had beers, and he was going to make me have some. So I avoided him to write. The next day, I watched as the buildings exploded and Steve was murdered. I drove his car home from the train station that night, the same station my father, his godfather, had parked in a generation before. So now we have William Morales in Cuba. We have a bill in front of the Senate, started by Marco Rubio when he was senator. Now he's pushing it as Secretary of State, as well as Ted Cruz and Rick Scott. It's called the Frank Connor Warner Forster Justice Act. It calls for the return of these terrorists from Cuba immediately. When I went to Gitmo in 2016 as a family member, it occurred to me that after 9/11, we went to war against a terrorist that killed my dad. Against a terrorist that killed Steve. But the terrorists that killed my dad were released. But things were changing. As a nation, we started capitulating to terrorists. We saw the left-wing terrorists entering our academia, people like Bill Ayers, Kathy Bodine, Bernadine Dorn, Ron Fiegelman, Susan Rosenberg, who was connected with the BLM movement this year, or 5 years ago. CCNY had a student center named for Guillermo Morales and Asanta Shakur. That's William Morales and Joanne Chesimard. They had a student center named in their honor, and my father went to CCNY. That's the kind of craziness we've gotten into our schools over the years. When you put terrorists teaching kids at places like Columbia, NYU, or other places, what do you expect except the riots on campus? And now we've seen a fusion of the Marxist and the Islamic terrorists in these campuses, and it's a very disturbing trend. I warned them at Gitmo in 2018 or 2016 that we could see that a future president may release KSM and the other high-value detainees, because they'll say, well, they never killed anybody. If they did, they would have died on the planes too. The same idea they use with the FALN, not mentioning that if you're a member of the conspiracy, you're responsible for all acts of that conspiracy, whether you were present there or not. So I'll go now, but I'll implore everyone to, we say never forget, but that's not enough. It's never forget and always act. Thank you.